Academy. I'm delighted to see so many people here this evening. A lot of that is down to Julie Whitworth from Cornucopia, and I'm really grateful to her for spreading the word about this really interesting event this evening. For those of you who are guests this evening and don't know about the How To Academy, just a quick word about us. We started about 6 weeks ago, and we're organising compact courses, as you will have been able to see from the slide, on everything from how to read Proust to how to do economics to how to photography in a weekend. So it's a wide-ranging. I don't know if any of you remember the old Dulux advertisements, which announced, had as their strap line, you find the colour and we'll match it. Well, we're sort of somewhat similar in that you find the course and we'll organise it. So we've got a whole range of new events that we'll be announcing. So if you're not already on our website, do sign up to the newsletter and you'll see a range of the interesting things that we're going to be doing, from how to listen to Bob Dylan to how to negotiate to how to read Chekhov. So a wide range of events. Now to this evening, and I'm absolutely delighted that we've got a wonderful panel of, well, there's 3 speakers, but in fact there's a 4th, Elif Shafak, who's about to come. And also this evening is going to be moderated by Tony Curzon-Price. Tony Curzon-Price, apart from formerly being a partner of mine in Intelligence Squared, was the editor of Open Democracy, and I'm absolutely delighted that he's going to be organising this evening, comparing it, and doing the question and answer. The format of this evening is each of the speakers is going to come up and make a presentation. That should take sort of 0 to 60 minutes, and after that we'll then have questions and answers from you all, and hopefully a very lively debate as to the future of Turkey. So without further ado, let me pass you to Tony Curzon-Price, who will take over for this evening. Thank you.
Welcome. I think we all are here because we believe that there's no more exciting or important time to try to understand Turkey, and this is the place to try and do that. This is the way how to do that. I will, as John has said, I'll just go straight into our speakers, and then we'll have a discussion right at the end. Our first speaker of the evening is the historian, Elif Mansel. He is, a number of his books are out on the desk outside: Constantinople, City of the World's Desire, Sultans and Splendor, and the organizer of a forthcoming conference, Levantine Conference, November next year in Istanbul. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Elif Mansel.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here. And of course, I don't understand Turkey. I think lots of people don't understand Turkey, including many Turks, particularly Turks in Istanbul. There are so many Turkeys, there are so many different Turkeys, as there are different, even in London there are different Turkeys. And I'd like to talk about some aspects that help make Turkey so varied, almost a continent as well as a country. More like America, perhaps, than a nation-state like England or France. Geography. Turkey has, as you can see, sitting in the Istanbul tram, the faces, they're every kind of variety, from Central Asia to North Africa, from Bosnia to Yemen. And if you meet Turks and ask them about their grandparents, where did they come from? Well, often they're from villages in Anatolia, but also very often they are from Algiers or Baghdad, or these incredible mix of peoples, and no more prominent example of that than Mustafa Kemal himself, who was born in Salonika in Europe, and his ancestry is a subject of constant debate, but clearly he was a citizen of the great cosmopolitan port of Salonika, and probably had Slav blood, or that certainly is what his enemy, the Sultan of Ataturk, said. And it's forgotten, I think, how much the Ottoman Empire was connected to Europe as Europe was to the Ottoman Empire. And it's been airbrushed out of European history. You can go to Dubrovnik, go around the museums and buildings in Dubrovnik. Nowhere will they say that it was a tributary state, a very happy tributary state of the Ottoman Empire for over 300 years, playing a double role, working for the Pope sometime and for the Sultan at other times. And so much is said about the traditional hatred of Austria or the bad French-Turkish relationship. Now it is forgotten that in fact Austria and the Ottoman Empire were devoted allies in the 19th century, and the most admired regiments of the Austrian army were Bosnians, and half of France, particularly the south of France, lived off trade with the Ottoman Empire. Marseille ran all French trade with the Ottoman Empire, which the merchants called our India. And a reflection of this European aspect of Turkey is the number of people of Albanian, Bosnian, and origin now living in Turkey. I've met some of them, and they're very proud of their origin. I won't say more. Also, Turkey was always a land of refuge, not only for Jews from Spain and Portugal, but also in the 19th century, refugees from the Austrian and Russian empires. Hungarians, Poles, Old Believers, Jews. So the great Turkish national poet of the 20th century, Nazım Hikmet, born in Salonika in 1902, was in fact a descendant of Konstantin Borzecki, who had fought in a Polish rising of 1848, then went to the Ottoman Empire via France, and he transformed himself into Mustafa Jalaluddin Pasha, a general in the Ottoman army. And Hikmet was a communist. He died in exile, and his Polish origin was extremely useful for him because in 1952 Poland gave him Polish citizenship in the name of Borzecki, a clear case of the advantages of multiple identities. And I think these multiple identities will emerge as it would be very interesting if there was a Turkish version of the television program, Who Do You Think You Are? And there will be a lot of surprises, beginning with Sabiha Gökçen. Geography, as well as nationality. There is a Black Sea Turkey, which is very different from Mediterranean Turkey. Mediterranean Turkey is different from Aegean Turkey, which is different from Anatolia, Ankara, Istanbul, worlds of their own. Thrace, and let's forget Thrace. I was recently in Mersin, a Mediterranean port, founded in the 19th century. My goodness, it's different from the Anatolian hinterland, and very modern and dynamic. It was living off trade with Syria and Iraq, and it is trying to reconnect to Alexandria, with which it has links since the 19th century. It was refounded by Ibrahim Pasha. Izmir is quite different from Istanbul, and it is in fact, although its population has changed, it has kept its character as Gavur Izmir, as it used to be known. It is called that by Erdogan, infidel Izmir, and it is the last bastion of secularism in Turkey. And another aspect of Turkey which is so varied, so changing, the language, the dialects, the different versions, the history of Turkish, long before Kemal's language reforms and adoption of the Western alphabet. That is I think, fairly unique event to change your alphabet in the 20th century. Turkish had absorbed 4,000 French words in the 19th century. Words like rendezvous and maîtresse, and of course, just as attractive for some of us, laïclik. It comes from French, and it is in many of Kemal's reforms. Kemal had been to France as well as Austria, and he admired the French Third Republic, the lay, secular, anti-clerical Third Republic. He had some of the books, and so he turned to France. And so it's just as Turkish to look to Paris or elsewhere as to look to Mecca. And this is reflected as the wonderful television programs the Ottomans have shown in diplomacy. As Turkey today tries to become part of the European Union, so in the past it repeatedly requested a formal written alliance with France. It didn't get it, but was in fact a practicing ally of France for 300 years, almost the only fixed point in European diplomacy. And so there were pincer movements on Austria organized by France and the Ottoman Empire, probably together and simultaneously. It also had other allies: Sweden, Poland, with a few gaps, the Netherlands, and England. And this is reflected in the spread of cafes, tulips, Turkish baths, and much else besides. And of course, England fought repeatedly for the Ottoman Empire. One reason why it was easy to kill Nelson on his battleship at Trafalgar is because he was wearing an aigrette given him by the Sultan to distinguish him. So he was an easy target for a Frenchman. And in the 19th century, this French-British-Turkish alliance produced the Crimean War, and it also produced extraordinary, before the Americanization of the 20th and 21st centuries, there was the Frenchification of the Turkish elite, which went further than is now remembered. French was the second language of the elite, as one elderly Englishwoman told me once about the city before 1914. It was all French. Everyone spoke French. And Istanbul, Paris was the Mecca of young Turks. I quote Abdulhak Sinasi Hizar: "We loved Paris just as one is in love with a person, body and soul. I saw Paris in my dreams, not as the lustful who thought only of the pleasures of the city, but rather as the devout Muslims who set out for Mecca in search of divine light." So for some, Paris was a source of divine light. And if this variety of Turkey, geographically, linguistically, historically, it's also reflected in the variety of Turkish Islam. No one party or one leader can claim to represent Islam. There is so many different Sufi orders, so many different groups like the Gulen movement, the Alevis. No one even knows how many there are because it has been they've been neglected and sidelined. And I think this variety of Islam in Turkey may be a source of strength, which will prevent, hopefully, one party or one group trying to hijack it for their political interests. And of course, Turkish Islam in the days of the Ottoman Empire was very different from other forms of Islam. It was the Ottoman Empire, represented by the reforming Pasha, Muhammad Ali of Egypt, the man who also turned Egypt towards France and Italy. It was they who suppressed the Wahhabis in 1817, and a member of the Al Saud dynasty's head was displayed, after so many others, at the gate of Topkapi Palace. So they were anti-Wahhabism and for that form of Islam. And maybe this variety of Turkey will be its strength in the future. Thank you very much.
Very much, Philip. I'd now like to invite Norman Stone to come and press us. Norman Stone is a historian who's advisor to Margaret Thatcher, and he divides his time between England and Istanbul.
Thank you.
Norman.
Well, thank you. And it reinforces one's belief in England that so many people would come to talk about something which is not, after all, major subject of conversation in England. Well done, and thank you. Philip, you missed the point. He was extraordinary. He's the national poet. My Turkish isn't good enough at that level. But all the Turks I respect think he's wonderful. And like all writers, he improved enormously by being in prison. I see this in my book with respect to Elif Shafak. And in prison, he met a refinement of Ottoman torture, with which I think the Turkish state to this day should be ashamed. In Turkish prisons in the 1930s, you were allowed to be visited by your ex-wife. As Philip has said, this is an enormous subject, 80 million people. I would have slimmed down Philip's remarks to saying that the Turks divide between piano movers and piano players. And that about sums up the racial side, but it's an enormous subject, and I think the only way you can do with an enormous subject like this is stop an anecdote. About 3 years ago, I had a health problem, emergency, down to my university is very efficient, and there's a private insurance thing, and they dealt me, and then it came to a question of getting out, and they said they need problems about small matters, and they wouldn't let me go until I produced my credit card. In fact, the university paid this account, and so I had to go for the next operation to a state hospital, and the state hospital Ataturk is very, very good. It was swamped with people, but I was dealt with perfectly well, and if somebody puts a bomb under the private insurance company, I'm quite happy with that. I'd like to do it myself. The excuse they found was that I had a health test. I'm 73 now. I had a health test in 1996. Hadn't declared on their form that I had too high cholesterol, therefore they weren't going to pay. You understand. The state system looked after me very well. Now, the state system in Turkey suffers from the sort of thing that everybody's health service suffers from. It's an expression of the general will of the people. Now, the general will of the English people is to be drunk at the weekend, and that destroys the health service at the weekend. But the general will of the Turkish people is hypochondria. Any peasant with a bad back turns up at Ataturk Hospital with his entire family. There's only huge bag of pills. Now they've dealt with this blessing. And that's why introductions are saying that this government, the Prime Minister of which, in his speeches, uses Quranic words, is said in Parliament, God says you will not drink, all this sort of thing. They've been very successful, and if you go to poor quarters of Ankara, Sincan, which is partly Kurdish immigrants, they will all say, we get medicine, we get looked after, that's that. The other thing that they have looked after is housing. If you go to a Turkish city now, you'll find ugly tower blocks of the sort that we know very well now should not be built. People are quite happy to live in them. They pay a small amount of mortgage, small interest, but they're living in what they think as modern circumstances. The next generation will no doubt go for crown trunks the way our people do. But for this generation, it was a huge success, and that man gets 50% of the vote. And the question in modern Turkey is this: why did it take an Islamic party to do it? It's the big question. And even now, when 80% of the educated class will say this man is a monster, he's got a huge block of supporters in places like Kayseri and Nevşehir, and that's the position we're in at the moment. And where do we go from here? I don't know. I don't know what's happened. It's very remarkable, but let us begin by admitting that he has been hugely successful. Do you know, when I first arrived in Ankara, there wasn't a proper rubbish collection. The camps said rubbish. There was a traffic jam, and nobody did anything about it. It was very difficult getting about. Now, Ankara, although it's not pretty, nobody will ever say Ankara is pretty. It's like a sort of, do you remember Babarville? It's like Babarville hit by Bangladesh. But it works very well as a capital city. You can get about it, hospitals, the bookshops, the Turkish opera, very good indeed. I saw Don Giovanni the other day. All that sort of thing. On that level, this government has been an enormous success. What went wrong? And I think it goes back to 1909, when, do you remember that famous moment in Davos? Now, Recep Tayyip Erdogan is not comfortable with foreigners. I remember seeing him just after he got out of prison in 1997, was it 8? And he was clutching an English teacher's self-book. He was on the way to somewhere in England, to a language school. And he's had his training has been 1 in Quranic memorization and 2 in football team management. He's not going to be a linguist, and it doesn't work. And he doesn't know foreigners, and he will use foreigners as a sounding box for his own people. So he ranted at poor old Shimon Peres. You know how to kill. I mean, Israel has killed in the Gaza Strip, or for that matter, since 1948. 0.1% of the number of Muslims killed by Muslims. It was an absurd, embarrassing thing for him to say. His predecessor in this Islamic way of thinking was Erbakan. And his idea was an Islamic foreign policy. I mean, can you imagine a Catholic foreign policy? Brazil and Poland, I mean, it's mad. And Erbakan lined up in the Libyan desert, Gaddafi, 3 Nigerian plug uglies, some sergeant major running Sierra Leone, some people from Iran, and they all were lined up. And Gaddafi ranted at the Kurds and said, Ataturk said, "You're not dealing properly with the Kurds." And the Turkish foreign minister looked at Gaddafi and said, "Bear ups, Bedouin." Collapse of Islamic foreign policy. Now that's unfortunately something which this government has not learned from. It has stumbled into the Syrian involvement, and Turkey is now facing landmines everywhere. An internal dissension, problems with every one of the Arab countries. It has landed flat on its face. Now, why? Why has a government which has been so successful until 2011 decided to make an enemy of potential allies? I mean, someone like myself, not only neutral, but I've been living in Turkey for 20 years, and hugely well inclined towards the country, hugely. I would have become a Turkish citizenship, and I still might become a Turkish citizen if Scotland becomes independent. have been very successful, yes. That's a crime. And I think in the end, you know, I'm afraid, I know I will offend this audience, but I will have to say that in the end, Islam is not capable of creating a modern state. It goes megalomaniac. Let's take the real predecessor of this government, which is Abdul Hamid. The Turkish reformers in the 19th century have done this. Philip has described it brilliantly in the Constantinople book. Have done a very good job of getting Islam to do all sorts of things. You know, they change it. Look, if you start with the Sharia law, the law of God, God says, I do, even 15 centuries later. It's lunatic. The Tanzimat said, let's change all that and do it very subtly, and they did. So you get things like town planning in a Turkish town, whereas under the Sharia law, the occupants have the right to dictate the shape of the street. It's like a kind of mad version of English rent control. And the Tanzimat get round that. Then comes Abdul Hamid, who adopts, well, even he overdid Islam. He redid the script to make it more Islamic than before. It's like sort of Wallace Long sort of autumn. And he pushed through the course of modernization. It was enormously successful. Reformed the finances, got all the foreign investment. Philip was talking about Mansel, I could talk about Galata. The banks, stable currency, railways, it all goes ahead, female education, good relations with foreigners. And then he creates somehow such a tidal wave of discontent with the Young Turks. He's overthrown. The Young Turks say, we don't want any more of this nonsense. We're bored stiff with all this religiosity. It means nothing to us. I read last night in Cambridge an old book, which the Young Turks Bible about Islam. A man called Reinhard Bose, who was a very interesting Dutchman, who was, oh God, that awful fool Said, who said, Orientalists were somehow insulting the Orient. Reinhard Bose said, looked at the origin of the Quran, did the standard sort of thing that was being done by biblical critics in Germany in the 19th century, amending the whole traditional view of religion. And the Young Turks read that sort of thing. And then in 1908, with the usual economic background, we said, get rid of this. Now, I wonder whether something like that isn't going to happen with this government. I'm so disappointed with it. It has gone on producing this carnival religiosity. 8 exams in Galata, where I live, one after the other, like they're announcing a circus, which is not what the exam is about. A dreadful kind of dead hand over the media. I don't turn on the television now. I get the independent media off the television. And something is going to blow up. And it's a repetition of an old pattern in Turkish history. In the end, in the words of George Orwell about what happens in England, you can't do that there, here. The Turks are human beings. Thank you.
Before we go on to the next speaker, does anyone need to turn off a mobile phone? Are we? Okay. A book of Norman Stone's outside, Turkey, A Short History, I think, is outside on the table. Our next speaker, two historians, time for a journalist, Andrew Finkel, who's written for most of the major publications from Turkey, a Turkey specialist. His book is out there, Turkey, What Everyone Needs to Know. Andrew Finkel is also the originator, the spirit behind a media platform, a website that looks to encourage independent media in Turkey, Platform 24. Andrew Finkel, thank you very much.
particularly people who know about subjects already. And I suppose the only thing that we really have that other people don't have is that we have been witnesses to events. So rather than tell you how to understand Turkey, I'll talk about myself trying to understand things that I've seen in Turkey. And the principal phenomenon which I've seen, I first came to Turkey in the 60s as much younger then. I came to Istanbul of 1.5 million people. And now I live in Istanbul of 14 million people. Which means that every year, every 10 years of my acquaintanceship with this city, every 10, 15 years I have done that, the city has doubled in size. And I sort of think about it, the average age of a Turk, the mean age of someone living in Turkey is 29 years old, which meant that they were born after the military coup in 1980, whereas I came to Turkey in the 60s, so in a sense I feel myself to be more Istanbul-like than most people who were born then. But the phenomena of my lifetime, as it were, the thing that I've seen and the thing that has to be understood, I think, if one's going to understand Turkey, is that this is a population which has been on the move. So that when I first came to Turkey, it was not quite 70% rural. Now it's 70% urban. And if you think about it, well, I came to Turkey as a journalist, first as a child, then as an academic, and then, or one of the academic, and then read experiments, I became a journalist, and came back in sort of 1989, and you may recall that was the year the Berlin Wall fell, but I was working for a Turkish paper at the time, and I think we were late with the story, which was sort of a metaphor for the 90s, I think, in Turkey. But the first really major story I did was in 1989, was 300,000, they didn't all come in one moment, but 300,000 Bulgarian ethnic Turks were driven out by what was then the Zhivkov regime, still remember the Zhivkov, the party boss of Bulgaria. And they were coming in a train across the border, 1,500 people per train. Now, that was the year that the British imposed visa controls on Turks going to England, and the reason was 1,500 people per year had claimed asylum, mainly Kurds, claiming some sort of political refugee status. But here were 1,500 people every few hours coming on this train, apart from the ones coming by car, walking across the border, etc., etc., etc. And so this was 300,000 people on the move. Another major story I did was in 1991 when I walked up a mountain on the Turkish-Iraqi border, and there were 500,000 Iraqi-Kurdish refugees coming in my direction. Even I knew it was a story. So Turkey is surrounded by this movement of peoples, and when one thinks about what brought down the regimes of Central and Eastern Europe, yes, it was a bankrupt ideology, yes, it was a bankrupt society, but it was also the fact that if you open your borders, people would leave. It was the movement of population that brought down governments and regimes in that part of the world. And yet, of course, I live in a city where there's been this huge movement of people from the countryside to the city, and this expansion of people. So Turkey is a country which, of course it's changed, and of course, but it's not a country which has had color revolutions like so many other countries in its vicinity. It's not a country which has seen a wall crumble, or the sort of social upheaval of an Iraq or of Eastern Germany. But so the fact that there hasn't been that momentous political shift doesn't mean that there hasn't been this underswelling, this great political ferment underneath Turkey. So the thing is that Turkey has changed. It's changed as dramatically as the societies around it, but that change has been, in a way, concealed and is taking place over time. It's a question of sort of looking under the carpet, as it were, to see how things have changed. And like any industrializing society, you have people who are recreating their lives in different environments. It happened in, 18th century, 19th century Victorian England over a period of time. In Turkey, it's happened in my lifetime. And it's a dramatic thing to say. And this has bred a sort of post-war political class which has tried to capture the votes, but also the hearts and minds of the new migrants, the first generation, the second generation, the third generation migrants. And just perhaps as, the Church of England once regarded Methodists as great revolutionaries and people who were going to transform society beyond recognition, I think in retrospect we look at these what seem to be radical religious movements and saying, well, in fact, these were movements which gave people an identity and a meaning and a purpose during times of great social upheaval. So it's not, it's understandable in a way that religion has such a powerful force in Turkish society, and that a kind of political party which can identify and exploit that religious sentiment will be a success. Now, the other thing, of course, is that what has changed about the city that I knew and the city that I grew up in and the city that I love is that it has changed out of all recognition. So I think of Istanbul as the enemy of nostalgia, that anything that you latched onto, something that the reason that you were there, the reason why it's so attractive to you, you better look at it quickly because tomorrow it may be gone. I can recall going back to the Philadelphia where I grew up, the house where I lived, and I don't know if you've seen Wild Strawberries, where the old man comes back in his imagination in black and white to see this, his childhood, but I wasn't that old, but nothing had changed in the street where I grew up in the suburb of Philadelphia, whereas I don't expect the view from my window to be the same in Istanbul. Things change at a dramatic pace. And of course, they don't simply change, they generate money, living rent. So the thing that I object to about this current government is less the fact that it is exploiting the religious sentiments of its people, perhaps, than the fact that it's doing so with an ulterior objective, which is to develop Istanbul and to build wherever they can, whatever they can, whenever they want, and to realize the vast profits that can be made if you turn a park into a shopping center, or if you generate a change of use for build a skyscraper on a land which can't support that sort of use. So I'm seeing the sort of degradation, I think, of the city that I live in, that a city which is 14 million perhaps, but then will become stretched to the limits of 16 million, but the government has created these plans to build huge canals, to build a third Bosphorus bridge. I mean, the only point of building a third bridge across the Bosphorus is that it will lead to the conurbation of the remaining green belt in Istanbul, which will conceivably lead to climate change, which will threaten the viability of this city. And it's that sort of cavalier attitude towards the urban fabric, which upsets me, I think, more than the fact that the piety of perhaps the false piety of some of its leaders. Now, how did we get to this point? Norman has then asked very correctly, and of course I have my own theories. I came to Turkey in the mid-60s after a military coup. I came as a doctoral student in October, on Independence Day, October 29, 1980, after the 12th of September military coup. So I was studying Turkish in Cambridge in 1971 when there was another military interregnum. So there has been this dependency, I think, in Turkish politics. There was almost a sort of evil symbiotic relationship between the democratic aspirations of its people and an authoritarian movement. And this relationship between sort of authority and allowing people to do what they want and then express what they want. It's always been a difficult relationship. So you've had this, as it were, the irresponsibility of politicians during the 70s, 80s, 90s, and they did so always in the knowledge that they would be contained by the advent of the military coup. Turkey, as you know, is not a country that possesses vast resources, mineral resources. It doesn't have what is in the economic literature is the curse of petrol of one resource. But what it does have is the curse of its own strategic significance, that it's been a value to its Western allies, and that its Western allies have, as it were, winked an eye and supported its bad habits. So, why make a fuss about what's going on inside Turkey when what you're really after is its value as your strategic ally in a particular region. So there's been a great sort of tolerance towards to Turkish political forms, and this uneasy relationship between authority and democracy. Now, I mean, the sort of two events, I think, have changed the nature of the whole debate in Turkey. And I count, I think, for the rise of the government party, and there's not a lot of time to talk about them, but the one was an earthquake. I mean, it was literally an earthquake in 1999, in which you had a post-war political machine which which basically solicited the votes of its population by turning a blind eye to this unplanned urbanization, and that machine literally collapsed in an earthquake in 1999, so that suddenly you needed, society became aware of the need for a regulation of the way this urbanization was happening. The other major event, of course, was the economic crisis of 2001, in which you had a post-war system. And the extraordinary thing about Turkey, which to my mind is incredibly telling, is that the average rate of inflation in the 1990s was 70% per annum. Now, and it's hard even to imagine that. It wasn't sort of Weimar style of inflation, which you needed a suitcase to buy a loaf of bread. It was, what your salary wasn't worth the same at the end of the month as it was at the beginning of the month. Inflation is a very disorientating thing, that degree of inflation. You don't know what things are worth, you don't have no sense of value. It's a very corrosive and pernicious political force. But why it existed was the government was financing its deficit, its bad habits through inflation, essentially. It paid a huge price to the domestic market, and there was a premium on that inflation. Now, Turkey is an Islamic country, of course, and interest rates in Islam are forbidden, but you don't really need to be very Islamic or very religious to understand that a system which taxes the worst off in society through inflation as a tax is going to produce discontent. And you have a system in which it was very much like a man sitting on a branch and sawing away with a certain knowledge that the branch wasn't going to collapse. Governments tinkered with reform during the 1990s in the sense that the system of spoils would never really break, that the whole post-war political machine could continue as it was. But eventually the branch snapped. And in one day in 2001, overnight interest rates had reached 7,000% in order to stabilize the currency. And it's not entirely a coincidence that in the election of 2002, no political party which had been in parliament before 2002 was re-elected to parliament. So you had a whole political generation obliterated at the 2002 election. Now, and the final point I would explain is that this government came to power in 2002, this current Justice and Development Party, led by Tayyip Erdogan, and it came as a reforming power. But they came under the mandate of a 1982 constitution, which had been written when Turkey had been under martial law. And this was a constitution which basically allowed citizens to do whatever they want, whenever they wanted, except in every particular instance when the authorities didn't want them to. So it was basically a yes-but constitution. It created all these nodes of power and authority within the state, which allowed the unelected bureaucrats to control what was going on. So, for example, I tried to the compere said I was trying to form this association. To form an association in Turkey is you have to have the patience of saying. I don't have time to explain just how long it takes, but it would be weeks just to do the paperwork to do it fine, because it has to be controlled by the state. There has to be control mechanisms built into every instance of Turkish life. Now, everyone knows that this constitution had to change, and that it was not a constitution which would allow a society like Turkey, a young society, a vibrant society, an economically buoyant society to develop its potentials. And the government has changed the constitution in previous governments. Before it had changed the constitution, and some of these changes were done under the rubric of Turkey's accession, it desired to begin talks with the European Union, which it did in 2004. But it's a sort of Lord of the Rings moment. It's a Frodo Baggins moment. You have this 1982 constitution, which gives you enormous power. You know you should throw it in the fire, but when you put it on your finger, it feels pretty good. And so, what politician has given up authority and power? It's certainly not the president. There's lots more to talk about, but I defer to greater wisdom, so that we can answer questions later.
Andrew Finkel, and after two historians and journalists, what better way to get under the skin of the country than a novelist? And so I'm very, very pleased to welcome Elif Shafak, who is a well-known novelist, but not only a novelist, also an academic, founding member of the European Council of Foreign Relations, and I think you'll find outside a number of novels, The Bastard of Istanbul, 40 Rules of Love. Welcome, Elif Shafak.
It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm also looking forward to your questions, having a dialogue afterwards. Now, how to understand Turkey. One of the things that I hear most often from foreign observers who take a particular interest in Turkey and the political machinery in Turkey is just how difficult it is to understand the country and how politics runs in Turkey. And I'm always intrigued by that verb, to understand, not to analyze necessarily, not to judge, but to understand. It's a word that matters to me, that I find close to my heart. So whenever I hear someone making such a complaint, I always nod sympathetically and listen. What I do not say, in general, what we do not say as Turks, is a confession. We do not confess that we Turks also find Turkey remarkably difficult to understand. So it's not only foreign observers that find the country bewildering, confusing, but us as well. We too have more questions in our minds than answers. We too can't help asking those questions to each other, among ourselves. We too are constantly trying to understand what is happening in the country and what is going to happen tomorrow. So the two questions that we ask each other very often are, what's going on and what's going to happen tomorrow? This present moment and how it's going to affect, the country in the short run and in the long run. I have been commuting between London and Istanbul for quite some time now, and I realize, without noticing, without paying much attention to it, on the phone, whenever I talk to a friend, to my husband, to my mother, one of the questions that I ask is, how is the country? I do this automatically, as if the country was a relative, was a friend, and you just need to keep an eye on that friend, because you never know, you just need to check constantly and make sure that that friend is doing okay. Why is that? Why is that feeling with us all the time? In other words, how can a country be almost equally bewildering, confusing, not only for foreign observers, but also to its very native inhabitants simultaneously? How is that possible? I think one of the reasons why it is like this is because Turkey is a liquid country. Istanbul is a liquid city. And this is a liquid geography we're talking about. In other words, this is not a country that has finished its political evolution and reached a certain stage and dropped anchor there and has become something. But in my opinion, Turkey is constantly in the process of becoming something, always. So it's open-ended, it's an ongoing process. It could go in every direction. One of my writer friends the other day, he was saying, I don't think many writers in the world feel the need to consult newspapers to check the news, the breaking news, before tweeting. In Turkey, before we tweet, let's say about literature, about culture, about daily life, you have to check the news or the TV and make sure nothing major, nothing dramatic has happened. If nothing has happened, then good, I can tweet about culture, about literature. But you always should keep an eye, because any moment, anything can happen. So we're constantly living with that feeling, which can be not only confusing, but also quite tiring sometimes. Turkey is obviously an amalgamation of mesmerizing conflicts and contradictions. It's incredibly multi-layered. So things that you might not be used to seeing together, you can find in the same context in Turkey, somehow coexisting. Coexisting doesn't necessarily mean that they're functioning in harmony, but somehow they form their hybridity, they form the synthesis. But this complexity can be a source of strength, it can be a source of richness, but at the same time I think it can be a source of tension, constant tension, and we are experiencing both simultaneously, the strength and the tension at the same time. So how do we approach Turkey? I think one dilemma is the conceptual tools that we're so used to taking for granted in academia, especially in the media. Those conceptual tools might not be enough to understand this liquid nature, this complex nature of Turkey, because Turkey is a threshold society. It's always in between things. So we need additional conceptual tools, in my opinion. Obviously, we talk about authoritarian regimes, we know how an authoritarian regime functions like, and when you compare Turkey with the typical authoritarian regimes throughout the Muslim world or in the Middle East, clearly it's not a typical authoritarian regime. And then what we have on the other side, we have Western democracies. Well, when you compare Turkey with Western democracies, clearly it is not a mature democracy. It is a democracy, but what kind of a democracy? I think it's an immature democracy. It's a bruised democracy. Bruised because this is a country that has gone through 3 military takeovers, as Andrew pointed out, each worse than the one before, and each left an incredible bruise on the society, not only on the constitution and the laws, but on the psyche, on the people, and especially the fear of the state, the fear of authority runs very deep in our souls. So it is a bruised democracy. I do believe that at the same time it's a belated democracy. And belated is an important concept because we think we have been late to modernize. We think we have been late to catch up. It is very clear when you look at the writings of late Ottoman intellectuals that they wanted to speed up the flow of time. Perhaps it's no coincidence that time runs very fast in Turkey. You know, they did their very best to speed it up because they were saying, well, we started printing with 300 years, 3 centuries of delay when you compare it with the Western printing machine. When you compare it with Western institutions, we started modernizing much later. This we did much later. So there's this notion in our minds that we have been late, that there's a gap that we need to, you know, cover, and therefore we need to speed up. And in my opinion, this notion of being late to something, this belated modernity, has been very harmful because it brought along a top-down modernization which created its backlash from the society. So how do we discuss Turkey? How can we develop a better approach, a fresh approach to understand this very, very complicated society? I think one of the things that needs to be done is to stop focusing just too much on politics. There's an overemphasis on, you know, how politics is done in Turkey, what politicians are doing in Turkey, and how the political apparatuses work in Turkey. I am by no means not denying the importance of politics. It is extremely important, but I think in order to understand Turkey, we have to look at the culture as well, at the society as well, at daily life, you know, small things, minute things that might not be on our radar if we focus too much on the political elite or the up-party government. There is a bigger framework that is giving birth to this government, and it is that framework, it is that political culture, you know, the background that we need to understand, in my opinion. We should also understand that to us, the state is the father. We are constantly looking for a Baba figure in every sphere in Turkey. So in politics, not only in politics, but also in sports, in every area, you want to find the right Baba figure and expect that person to solve your problems. This is incredibly harmful, because it also brings an expectation on the part of the state that if you give rights to people, people should be grateful. Yeah? As long as we keep seeing the state as a father figure, we won't be able to have a mature democracy. So I think we need to start focusing on other areas than politics in a narrow sense. The second area, in my opinion, that needs to be incorporated in every analysis in Turkey is emotions. I know it might sound weird, but when I read political analysis on Turkey, there's always, you know, this expectation that if there are certain factors, these factors will give birth to certain consequences. This is a very rational framework. We in Turkey, we're not that rational. We are very emotional people. And I think emotions are very important in Turkish politics. Sometimes politicians do certain things, behave in certain ways, not because that's the rational thing to do in that moment, but because of their emotions, because it's tit for tat. You know, if there's Islamophobia on the rise, if there's Turkophobia on the rise in France, well, we don't want to do anyhow, it's tit for tat. You know, it's that kind of emotional backlash that I see all the time in Turkey, almost childish sometimes, but I think emotions and feelings should always be in the picture, because it's not a very rational world in that sense. Also, I believe we need to focus on absences, not only on presences, but absences as well. Because when we are analyzing Turkish politics, I realize, you know, we look at, again, the political elite, the institutions, the things that exist. But we need to talk about the things that do not exist as well. You know, because this is a society that used to be a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious, vast empire. Imagine, out of that, a nation-state was carved out based on the notion of sameness. So there's this fear, very deep in our psyche, of losing territory, losing something, shrinking, fear of shrinking, yeah, becoming smaller. That fear runs very deep, and absences, we live with those absences. Amnesia is very, very big in Turkey. We have huge collective amnesia, and let us not forget that this is a society that changed its alphabet. So today, when a Turkish citizen is walking on the streets of Istanbul, when I see an Ottoman tombstone, if I can't read the Ottoman script, I don't know who has been buried there. I don't know what that building is about. I have no notion, I have no connection with the alphabet. That creates a huge rupture. Also, let us not forget that this was a very cosmopolitan society, and it shrunk to an artificial notion of sameness. So absences are very important, because those absences create psychological factors that, in my opinion, should be taken into account. Also, we need to take into account women's voices more, because if we focus mostly, primarily, on politics and the political elite, we won't be hearing the voices of Turkish women. Why is that? When you look at Turkey, you will see that women are quite vocal and very visible in almost every space, like academia, media, obviously arts, literature, advertisement, you name it. However, there is one area in which women are almost non-existent, and that is politics. So at the local, regional and national level, women are almost non-existent, and the few women who are out there have to defeminize themselves in order to survive as strong figures. So if we focus too much on politics, we won't be hearing women's voices, but those voices are important. Clearly Turkey is a very sexist society. Clearly it's a very patriarchal and male-dominated society, but there are again many layers. Because it can be quite matriarchal at the same time. Matriarchal doesn't mean there's gender equality, it just means there's the power of one woman. But what I'm saying is, we need to include the voices of women. Another important factor for me is there's too much focus on top-down analysis, whereas we need to look at bottom-up as well. And we saw the significance of this after the Gezi events this summer. You know, the youth, people coming from grassroots movements. We never took the voices of these people into account when analyzing Turkey because of this extreme top-down analysis. So the opposite needs to be done from now on. And finally, I think, in order to understand the quality of democracy in a country, we need to focus not on the majority, as the government is constantly doing, but on the minorities. What is the situation of the minorities? And when I say minorities, it's not only ethnic minorities, it's not only religious minorities, but sexual minorities as well. Any and every kind of minority. How is their position? Has that improved in Turkey? Minority has always been a concern for me in my writing, in my novels. So I will try to wrap up by saying things are constantly shifting in Turkey. Things are constantly changing, and the boundaries are always blurred. Today, more than before. Again, with the Gezi events, we have seen, we never thought this would happen, that the Kurdish nationalists holding hands with the Turkish nationalists and running away together from a tear gas. We never thought this would happen, you know. We thought these identities were rigid. We have seen that they are not. It is a liquid country that is constantly trying to redefine itself. Positive things, very positive things can happen in Turkey at the same time as very negative things. Sometimes even on the same day, even within the same context. And in my opinion, in order to understand the country better, we need to take into account both the positive and the negative together. Now, this is very difficult to do in Turkey. Why? Because we have become extremely polarized. You might say, well, America's polarized as well. You know, we have seen what happened in America right recently. Okay, it has become polarized, other countries too. But in those countries, there's a tradition of democracy. There's a separation of powers that is not affected by this over-polarization. Whereas in Turkey, everything is affected by this extreme polarization. So it has boiled down to this. You're either you venerate the government or you hate the government. Either you're here or you're there. And there's incredible anger and resentment on both sides. And both sides want to know, are you one of us? Are you one of them? And I find this incredibly unhealthy for a society, for any society. So in my opinion, Turkey's new minority is people who want to just go beyond this madness, who want to overcome this duality, yeah? Who want to not to be trapped in this conservative versus Kemalist duality, which in my opinion, at the end of the day, is equally authoritarian on both sides. So people like us, people who want to move beyond this dualistic framework, we are becoming Turkey's new minority, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, Elif Shafak. It's now time, it's your turn to ask questions, to participate, to make comments. I'll invite our panelists to come and sit in front here, and I'll sit in the middle. So, Philip, Elif, Norman, Andrew, and do introduce yourself when you have a question, a comment. There's a roving microphone. Who'd like to go first? We have a gentleman on there, back.
Thank you very much. First of all, my name is Riza Yunel. Born and bred in London. My parents are originally from Ordu, Turkey. I'm very much interested in Turkish history, politics, being Turkish myself. I mean, apart from Miss Shafak, a distinguished panelist, and I've been reading them for 20 years. Professor Stone, since his days in the Telegraph in '88. Andrew Finkel from today's Zaman, Taraf, and Caroline Finkel's books, etc., and Philip Mansel's Constantinople book. I mean, you're obviously biased against Erdogan, and you may be right to be so, but how on earth can you criticise him and then praise a dictator, a tyrant, despot called Mustafa Kemal? And I'm not going to use the word Ataturk, because nobody is a father of Turks. Okay, so how can you praise a dictator, a man who committed cultural genocide against the Turks and the Kurds to bring about a so-called laïc or secular state, okay, who destroyed our language, culture, as you mentioned. You can't read Nottingham 2. I can't read my grandfather's letter. My grandfather died in 1980, not 600 years ago. I can't read them. And he was a very cultured, educated man. Why on earth do you support a tyrant despot who died in a
Okay, I think
friendly rage, and then
we've got the question.
which may be legitimate, but you've got to be consistent. Thank you very much.
Good, we've answered the question. I'll take another couple of questions and then prepare some answers. The gentleman with the mobile phone.
My humble apologies to Norman Stone for interrupting. It's really a question to Mr. Finkel. I fully accept that there has been a commercialization of Istanbul, as there have been of many cities, including London. The Green Belt issue around London is just as live an issue as the destruction of Istanbul. But the destruction of Istanbul's skyline started before the AK party came to power, and some of the biggest monstrosities were built before it. But you said quite rightly, the population was booming. What would your solution actually be to a burgeoning population if there wasn't more construction? And you mentioned briefly the European Union negotiations. No one has actually said what the impact of the dragging of the feet by the European Union on politics in Turkey has been, and to what extent that has actually given impetus to make it.
Okay, so we have two questions there, and then let's take one more question. The gentleman in front.
Mine is not really a question, it's a comment. I've been educated by the speakers this evening, but my own knowledge of Turkey goes back to the 1970s, when I was the Bank of England's economic advisor on Turkey, and I participated in debt talks, because Turkey was virtually bankrupt, but Britain had to apply to the Paris Club for debt relief, and then later on I met Turgut Özal, who at that time was Under Secretary of the Treasury, and later became President. And after the 1980 revolution, he was the chap who opened up the economy to Western influences. In those days, there were about a dozen planes coming into Ankara a day, and into Istanbul there might be 100. It was a tiny little airport, and Turkey just really closed to the rest of the world. One of the things that's happened since then is that vast numbers of Turks have been abroad and been educated in America, in Germany, and some in Britain. And many have gone back, and they've set up, with the help of local Turks like the Sabanci family, they've set up huge economic businesses throughout Turkey. And the whole economic picture of Turkey has changed so completely in such a relatively short time. Now, I've had a house in southern Turkey for 20-odd years, in a small village in which I was the only person who had an inside toilet on a car, and later on a telephone. But now, the village has doubled in size. Almost everyone has a mobile phone. Most families have a car.
Okay, so we have a lot of economic growth. Is there more?
What I'm saying is that the economic influence of the West on Turkey has been staggering, and will go on being staggering. And through tweeting and all that had an impact on the activity in Taksim Square, around Taksim Square last year, and will go on having an even bigger impact in the future.
Thank you. Thank you for the comment. So we had 3 direct questions. One was, Norman, would you like to take it? The question of what is the defense for the great modernizing leap by Ataturk?
I think if we attempt to do that, create bad
Sorry.
Yes.
I think if we try to deal with that sort of subject, we'd be here for the next 3 hours and a civil war would result. So I'll stick to 2 points. On the change of the script, Turkish has got 8 novels. Arabic has got 3 very weak. A sentence in Ottoman can mean 12 different things. Look at Geoffrey Lewis's book on the Turkish language reform. I think they went obviously far too far in the direction of getting rid of Arabic and Persian words. I mean, that was ridiculous. It's the Tarabokization of the language. But the alphabet reform, I think, is defensible. But the point is, the Arabic world translates 300 titles every year. The Turks translate 11,000. And you've got a literate population, whether it reads the football rules or not. I mean, that's all I can say about it. The other point is, if Ataturk had not existed, you would have been part of the Pontus Republic of Greeks.
Would like to take that question.
About, language, the script, alphabet.
It was nothing about cultural genocide, and you know that.
Okay, so, sorry, you've had your say. Let our panelists speak.
Like the Chinese and the army.
Sorry, you've had your say.
Thank you.
Obviously, it's a very, again, emotional subject for many of us, because we look at it from different angles. If you're a Kurd, you might interpret it differently. If you're a woman, like my mother, for instance, and many women like my mother, had a huge respect for Ataturk because of the things, the rights that Turkish women enjoyed. So depending on where we're looking from, we might have a different picture. Maybe we need to put together all of those fragments together to have a healthier, view of the period, because we're talking about 1920s, 1930s. Yeah. It was a different world back then. But I am critical of many things that the Kemalists have done, but I think there were positive things that they did as well, and we can talk about both sides at the same time. As you said, changing the script was, I agree, a more technical step, but what I can't understand as a writer is purging words coming from Arabic or Persian. I mean, when you look at an Ottoman dictionary, I have one constantly with me in my daily life. It is this thick. I'm not exaggerating. It's pretty thick. When you look at a modern Turkish dictionary, it's half the size. Hundreds and hundreds of words are gone. I can't say colors in Turkish. I can say red, I can say yellow, but the shades in between are gone because they came from Persian, and we said, well, Persian is not Turkish. So we Turkified the language the way we Turkified the country. In my opinion, the main problem, the main mistake that the Kemalists did was this ideology of sameness. The notion that we all have to be the same, in order to live together. We didn't have to be the same. we were not the same. That one was Kurd, that one was Cherkess, this one. It was okay, we could coexist together. Why not? Why can't you find a supranational identity that is, above all those ethnic identities? Why can't you find common values that keep people together? So I think this ideology of sameness in language, in culture, in politics, in daily life, it was very, very harmful. But let us not go extreme on either side. I mean, venerating Ataturk too much, having his statues, pictures, portraits everywhere, I think it's too much, because we can't see him as a human being anymore. He was a human being. So that is one extreme. But to hate him and say he was, so bad, and that's another extreme. And I don't think either extreme is the right approach.
Let's apply the same thought to a couple of minutes as well.
Thank you. There was a question about urbanization and what would your, Norman mentioned the degree to which this government has delivered in terms of housing. So what's your solution for urbanization? And Philip, would you like to take the question on the EU afterwards? Yes. Just a warning.
But urbanization, as I said in my remarks, we had this sort of skewed urbanization over the 1950s. You had a laissez-faire approach to urbanization. And that it's a complicated subject, but that laissez-faire approach was proven to be bankrupt with the earthquake that I mentioned. So it's not that Turkish cities didn't grow and that they didn't grow ugly, but that they grew in a particularly piggly way under the patronage of a political machine. But now the rewards are so much greater. Istanbul, because of the economic processes and the globalization and the fact that it's now part of the international real estate market as opposed to a protected market in which the lira is not convertible. It's the rewards and the incentives and the processes to develop Istanbul and realize the sort of the profits to be made from the development of Turkish city are just a sort of scale that didn't exist 10 years ago. And so with the economic progress that we've talked about is the need for better governance, the need for more transparent governance, and the need for one thing this government has done is it's made itself, it's more or less abolished its notion of economic accountability through legislation. And this was a government which came to power 10 years ago, promising to reform and promising to be less corrupt. So, one has to draw attention to development which is based on authoritarianism. And I think, people talk about Gezi Park, and they talk very eloquently about it, but the one thing you'll hear a lot about is, it's not about the trees, it's about something else. But, well, it is about the trees. It's about the fact that, within a consultative process of urban governance, you can't build what you want, where you want, when you want. You have to do it in consultation, and that was the point I was trying to make.
And Philip, you mentioned the desire of Turkey to become an ally of France in the 19th century.
It went on trying, and eventually it did get a French alliance, at least in the 19th century. Probably the same may happen with the European Union as the European Union evolves. And it is, as Elif rightly said, everything is over-emotionalized, perhaps, and it's seen as deliberately humiliating with Bulgaria and Romania come in and not us, Turkey. But, of course, it will be, in the end, of course, based on interest. And if it's seen to be in the interest of the European Union, then probably Turkey will finally get in. And I don't think this, a year or 2 years ago, there were great newspaper articles about reorientation, Islamic bloc looking to the Middle East, looking to Syria, Egypt, and Iraq. But I don't think that's going to happen. And always, as in the days of the Ottoman Empire, be looking west.
So dragging its feet, the EU dragging its feet, you don't think that is one of... Norman asked the question, how did this happen? What happened? The EU dragging its feet, was that part of it? And this might have been part of it.
No, I think that's a minor aspect, because the trade has boomed.
I would like to add that I think the way the Europeans controlled Turkey has been quite important in pushing it in this Islamic direction. You can see in the opinion number of people who were pro-European, say, 5 years ago. And there is one very concrete case with it. If you're a Turk, even an educated Turk, and you go to the American embassy, you've got a scholarship to an American university, paying their fat fees, they give you a 10-year visa in 24 hours. You go to the British embassy as a scholarship student, you have hell. I mean, I've just had a case, it's, you should say, all unhappy visa applications are unhappy in the same way. And I hear story after story after story after story. It's not surprising that the Turks are turning against Europe. Apparently we do it. I mean, I think, well, you forgive me if I say this, that I think things in England sometimes happen just because we're here. But in the European case, there's an attempt to squeeze the Turks about refugees. There's obviously an enormous refugee crisis building up in the Mediterranean on the Turkish border. Tidal waves of people. And it's already upset Greece, and Greece has got a million refugees. Italy, all this sort of thing. And we're trying to squeeze the Turks to take them back. And the Turkey is a growing country. It takes a robust view of these things that don't come here. We can't look after you. So there's that sort of problem. We're putting the squeeze on them by making life difficult about visas for ordinary Turks. I mean, it's not a good way of making friends and making people think, oh, Europe's ideal, is it?
Okay, thank you, Norman. Now there's a question in the back row, the lady in the back row, the lady in the middle, and the lady in red.
Thank you. You spoke about the need for a Baba
Can you introduce yourself?
Sure, my name is Aral Samadus. You spoke about the need for a Baba figure in Turkey. I would very much like to know, a need for a Baba figure. Where does it come from, historically and psychologically? And also, could this Baba figure smooth out the polarization of the society? Thank you.
There was the lady halfway down. Yes, that's right. In the green. I can't see the colours very well, but yes, that's right.
Hello. The name is
yeah.
The name is Jessie Harrington. I have two questions. One of the questions is, how does the Arab Spring affect the direction that Turkey is taking? And the other one is an internal question, is have there been any reforms in how quickly a court case moves in the country, because it takes like a long time for court cases to move on.
Very good. And then the lady in red jacket.
Yes, my name's Diana Dark, and I'm a writer on Eastern Turkey. And I'd like to ask about the population. It strikes me there's a big east-west divide, and I know that Erdogan has said that all mothers should have 3 children. And when I've been travelling in the East, people say to me, that what Erdogan's really saying there is he wants people in the West who are frightened of even having 1 or 2 at the moment to increase to 3, and he wants people in the East who have 8 or 10 routinely to bring it down to 3, so that the Kurdish population doesn't end up making the Turkish population a minority. And I'm wondering how, because I saw a figure that in about, I think it's 2040, Kurds might actually overtake Turks within the country.
Okay, so there's 3 questions. I think, Elif, could you take at least 1, if not 3 of them?
About
the need for a Baba.
Failure, the need for a Baba.
Where does it come from?
I think it comes back from the Ottoman days. I don't know if the other speakers would agree, but we do have this strong state tradition, and that is still continuing in Turkey. So if there are reforms to be introduced, well, the state will introduce those reforms, The state will know the limits, where to draw the limits. That is, let me give you some examples from daily life. Even when we speak, let's say with my mother, she would say, but the state gave us our rights. You see, it's always the state giving something. whereas she doesn't think that there was a very strong women's movement in 19th century Ottoman Empire. You know, it was an accumulation, you know, all these women striving, struggling, one step after another. We don't think it was an accumulation of our struggles, but we think it's always the state giving us something, bestowing it upon us. So that approach runs very deep in Turkey. I do not believe that a Baba culture can smooth out the polarization. I think it makes it even worse. And we have seen this recently in the democratization package. When it was announced, there were positive things about that package. There were negative things about that package. But maybe I should say negative, but it wasn't enough. It would have been enough 5 years ago, 7 years ago. Today, it's not enough anymore. People have higher expectations. So the perception was, like children, you know, we gathered around that democratization package, expecting there to be a present for all of us. So the Alevis expected something, writers expected something about freedom of opinion, freedom of expression. Every minority expected something, and when they opened the package, we realized some children had gotten their presents, some others had been forgotten. So that is what happens when you see the state as a father. So some children are being treated as secondary citizens, some are more important. We have to change the whole notion of Baba approach and start thinking of, you know, politics as something that happens from bottom up, not from there on us.
And of course there were frequent rebellions, particularly in Anatolia throughout the history. The Young Turk Revolution was a world event, and that was against Baba Abdulhamid.
So Turkey has the resources in its past and has shown its ability to do that.
The only problem is, you know, because we love authority so much, the moment you topple down an authoritarian person, you become the next authoritarian person. We need to break that vicious cycle.
So toppling, there was a question about the influence of the Arab Spring, and
Just a small question. Well, the Arab Spring is, I suppose, everyone has been confounded by the Arab Spring, not just Turkey, but particularly Turkey. Turkey, as you know, under the current government, had this sort of strange policy based on the fact that it zero problems with neighbors. It was a sort of catchphrase of the current foreign minister, which was basically an expression of pragmatism. Turkey could get along with everybody and then play its own national interests first, and you know, so that it could be friends, so that the Assads and the Erdogans went on holiday together, and you could be friends with everyone. But bit by bit, that policy crumbled, and Turkey felt obliged to take a more ideological and more moral foreign policy. And it basically banked on certain leaders to fall, and then some leaders fell, and some Arab leaders didn't fall. And so gradually, it basically got a lot of things wrong. It wasn't the only country to get things wrong, but it was certainly a country to get things wrong. And one of the bizarre consequences of this policy was that whereas Turkey portrayed itself under this government as being more of having a sort of cultural intuition with its region based on its Ottoman past, that it had what they call a strategic depth, that Turkey understood its neighborhood better than a lot of European, and certainly better than America, which investments up in Iraq so tremendously. Suddenly, Turkey, rather than becoming a sort of ambassador, an intermediary between these countries and the United States, found itself being drawn closer to America to defend itself from Syrian chemical weapons, or rather than being an intermediary in the disarmament of nuclear disarmament of Iran, became sort of dependent on America to sort of reach over. And so and of course it's tried to sort of cover this up for various ways. But I mean, if it sounds like we're being very sort of critical of this current government rather than being not critical of Ataturk, it's because we're living now and not then. As a journalist, your job is to criticize the people who are in power now, as opposed to the leadership of historians to criticize them.
So we have 1 minute left. Does anyone want to take the question on Kurds and population?
Yes, thank you for Diana Dark. 2 classic books about travelling around Turkey. My copies are very dominant. And you're exactly right. If you go to the Kurdish areas, it's unbelievably depressing to see the numbers of radical children being like bunches of graves. Obviously ruining the electricity, the sewage, everything in poor parts of the Albacore or whatnot. And it is a dreadful headache for Turkey. I think in the end there is a sign of hope, because as I speak, Kurds will be arriving in Western Turkey and speaking Turkish. And there are 7 Kurdish languages not developed. I mean, it's a long way removed from the attempt to revive something like Cornish, or dare I say Welsh. Norman Bennett said about Welsh, it's like Jurassic Park. You take a fossil, spend £100,000 million, and you create a monster. Well, I will go on.
We have 30 seconds. So unanswered questions. Does anyone want to pick up?
Talk about my court cases.
Well, if you in 15 seconds you want to tell us about the legal process and modernisation.
Well, I was put on trial once for something I read in the newspaper. I was glad it took a long time.
Obviously, we have this case of Article 301, insulting Turkishness. They changed it a little bit. They made it more difficult, because in the past, any citizen could say, I feel insulted as a Turk, and therefore a prosecutor would call you. You would have to go to the prosecutor's office. The prosecutor might decide a trial had to be initiated, and then you would find yourself in a court. For a year, you might find yourself booed on the streets and things like that. So there were all these repercussions. Nowadays, it's harder to do that, because ultimately the cases go to the Ministry of Justice, and the Ministry of Justice usually says, there's no need. So they haven't quite abolished Article 301, but they made it more difficult to start such cases. But that is not the solution, of course. I mean, the article needs to be abolished. Not only that, but any similar statements. Relatively speaking, in the past, I think Turkishness was more emphasized. These days, especially this year, we have had court cases. One of them was, of course, Fazıl Say's case, for a tweet, for a retweet about Islam. So things are changing on the surface, but deep inside, there's always this idea that words need to be controlled, words need to be curbed, and I think it's that instinct that needs to change, and for that to happen, the Constitution needs to change. So making amendments, like make-up, is not enough. The whole Constitution and the mentality is needed.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'd like you to thank our speakers.